This is going to be looking basically at the first two sections of the book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, uh, by Jonathan Haidt. And the the book is, I'm going to basically sort of try to summarize the first two sections of the book, which are the ones that are most directly related to the topic of the subtitle. Um, we'll talk a little bit about uh, the, the third part, but only a minute or two. Um, and he, the book is sort of organized chronologically in and tries to give you a sense of how he came to the conclusions he's doing. This was a really brilliant decision by whoever helped him edit, whoever his editor was, whoever helped him come up with the book, uh, assuming it wasn't his decision himself, because one of the great things we always like to do is to read about the person who goes from not understanding things and goes on a journey of self-discovery and discovery and winds up happy at the end, um, uh, knowing his place or her place in the world and how he or she fits into it. That's sort of the plot of Dickens' most popular novel, David Copperfield. It's the plot of many other novels. Of course, if you go to Russian literature, if you wind up knowing who you are and where your place is in the world, you're being exiled to Siberia. So, um, anyway, but the first section talks about the role of intuition and our emotions in our decision making. Um, and he organized it around the metaphor that the mind is like a rider on an elephant. Um, you have, and the rider is our rational thinking, and the elephant, which is obvious, the larger and much stronger uh, part of this pair, is our intuitive, emotional understandings of things. Um, yeah, so we'll go there. Excuse me, go back here. Then the second part is talking about the bases for morality. What are the things that people look at in order to establish moral systems, moral matrices? And as you might guess, if you stop to think about it, these vary depending on the nature of the person and, in some extent, where they've been raised and how they've been raised. Um, and everyone sort of blends the six taste receptors of of morality in different ways. So let's go back here to um, intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second. Um, he starts out by talking about the theory of moral development that was sort of in vogue when he got started in the field. This is Kohlberg's theory of moral development. Kohlberg was a disciple of Piaget, who's a French developmental psychologist. He is the man who invented the whole field of developmental psychology and child development. And Piaget has this idea that children develop their intellectually in stages. Um, for example, if you at a very early stage in a child's development, if you show them two pitchers of water that are both of the same in the same type of container at the same level, you'll ask them, "Do you have the same amount of water in both?" And they'll say yes. And then if you take one of those pitchers and pour it into a narrower, taller container, and you ask them, "Do you have the same amount of water in both containers?" They'll say, "No, there's more water in the big one, the taller one." Even though we know and we can tell them, "Well, no, they're the same, right? You said they were the same earlier." And um, as children develop, without being taught about conservation of mass or anything, any of the theories, they will instinctively learn that yes, if you pour water into a different container with a different shape, it's still the same amount of water. And Kohlberg's theories of moral development sort of were like that. Children start with an early pre-conventional stage of moral development, and they judge things based on very superficial features. Then as their children are young, this would be about grade school, they start to judge based on conventions, rules, and dictates of authority figures. One of the things was like a child went to school without wearing in a school that had to have uniforms. He went there without wearing his uniform. At this stage, children say, oh, they broke the rule. They did something wrong. Well, is it really wrong? And eventually, people, especially if they're good enough, get to the post-conventional stage where they judge based on the reasons behind the rules convention. So they start to think for themselves. And a man named Betrayal, who was Kohlberg's student, developed the theory that our moral judgments are based on issues of harm and fairness. That as we develop and go through these stages, we eventually reach the point where we recognize that immoral acts are those that harm other people or treat them unfairly, and that our moral judgments are based on those criteria. And a man named Richard Schneider responded to Kohlberg by eventually saying, no, you've got it wrong. He was thinking, this is a quote from the book, Schneider thought that the theories of Kohlberg and Betrayal were produced by and for people from individualistic cultures. He doubted that those theories would apply in Orissa, an area of India, where morality was sociocentric. Selves were interdependent, and no bright line separated moral rules preventing harm from social conventions, which were regulating behaviors not linked directly to harm. Okay. So Schneider created a series of stories about actions and asked people in Chicago and Orissa, this area in India, to state whether the actions were wrong or acceptable. And Schneider noticed very significant differences between respondents based on location. People that in India would, for example, if widows were not supposed to eat fish in India, and he had a story in which a widow knew that she's been told not to eat fish, but went ahead and ate fish anyway. All the people in India said, oh, this was morally bad. And people in Chicago are saying, why are we controlling people's diets like that? There's nothing wrong with it. And so that there were, of course, arguments back and forth between the two sides and who's right. So he tried to conduct his own research to get further information on this area. Interviewed people in two locations in Brazil, one in southern Brazil where he had a lot of European immigrants and is sort of somewhat closer to the United States, an area in northern Brazil where it was much more indigenous people and descendants of African-American slaves, which are culturally very, very much further away from the United States, and then people around Pennsylvania. He discovered that social class was as much a determiner of how people would respond as geographical locations. That is, working and middle class people in all of three of these areas had more in common and were more different from the educated, richer upper class people than the upper class people in the three geographical locations were different from themselves. And if people were convinced, would read the story, and the stories were designed to not have any actual harm caused by what people were doing. And if people were convinced that the actions in the story were wrong, they would invent harmful results from the action that were not in the narratives. So that is, if their guts told them that something was wrong, their brains would invent a reason that was not in the situation to claim that it was wrong. So it was obviously our emotions affect our judgments. And so he looks into what is the proper relationship between reason and the emotions or intuitions. The traditional answer in Western philosophy is Plato's. The rational soul, which is located in the head, is perfect. It is burdened by the imperfect soul or souls found in the body. He calls this view of this soul the rationalist delusion. The Platonic answer is very, very influential because of Plato's influence in Western theology, starting with Clement of Alexandria and Origen, and especially in the Western Church, St. Augustine of Hippo in the late 300s, early 400s. Massive amounts of Platonic thought wound up as part of Christianity. And our version of the soul is close to, in many respects, the rational soul of Plato. And one of the things about the Platonic idea is that there are also different kinds of souls. I don't know if any of you remember reading Andrew Marvell's poem to his coy lover in college, or high school. But there's a line in there where he talks about his vegetable soul. And in Platonic theology, thought, the vegetable soul is that part of the soul, or that soul that controls life processes, which is one of the things we all share with every living thing, including vegetables. So this is the dominant, for many people, the dominant thought, that you should make decisions based on cool logic, and try to tamp down and ignore your emotions and intuitions. Go back here. A man named David Hume in the 1700s had a different thought. Says reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Now, this is worth a little bit of digression. The people at that time were talking about this. There was a movement called either sentimentalism or sensibility, and the idea is that they recognize that our rational minds are really good at coming up with excuses for bad behavior. A properly designed set of feelings, a set of emotions that were trained up to the right way, would be less likely to let people go astray morally. And one of the things that you can, if you've either read Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility or seen Ang Lee's wonderful movie of the book, the very opening chapter starts with the death of the older Mr. Dashwood, who is the father of the two sisters who are the heroines of the book. And he tells his son, their half brother, on his deathbed, that he has to take care of them. And he comes to the conclusion that if he gives them each 2,000 pounds out of his estate, then everything will be fine. And it would be if he had done that. between the money they would earn on interest of that gift and the money that they already had coming in, they would be able to live in a comfortable gentry lifestyle, pretty much equivalent to what they had been used to. Well, he and his wife have this long argument where they go through various rational reasons why they shouldn't give that money to the two sisters and the mother. And they keep going through and saying, well, we'll do this, which is less, but oh no, there are good reasons not to do that. And we shouldn't take money away from our own son, should we? And eventually he argues them down to basically giving them nothing and ignoring his deathbed vow to his father. And of course, the thing is you have people who have no emotion, no sensibility in the sense of the novel in the 18th century, who wind up committing a morally heinous action just because they're guided solely by their reason, which is corrupted because it isn't also guided by a sense of proper emotion.
Yeah, another way to say that, I can't remember if it's Hume or someone commenting on that, is reason says what ought to be, passion says what will be.
Right. Yeah. And anyway, but that was a very common way of thinking of the moral emotions in the 18th century. It kind of got a bad name because of the actions of the French Revolution, where guided by the emotions of liberty for all, fraternity and equality, we wound up with 80,000 headless corpses. So emotions are have to be properly guided as well. He also talks about an answer that Jefferson has, which is sort of that intellect and emotion each have different areas which they take the lead, and that the field of morals is the domain of the emotions. Jefferson did this in a letter to a young woman with whom he may or may not have had an affair. Okay, but he looks at a man named Antonio Damasio who studies people with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is the area that controls our emotions. These people have various very low levels of emotions, yet they're retaining their IQ, their ability to do well on tests of moral reasoning. They have basically no ability to make decisions. And when they do make decisions, as often as not, they're decisions that have disastrous consequences. For Haidt, this supports Hume's model that we need our emotions properly directed to actually make good decisions. And he develops his rider-elephant metaphor to explain this. The rider is control processes, our reasoning. The elephant is all the things we do automatically, including intuition and emotions. The elephant is by far the larger thing. We've been dealing with things at the level of our prefrontal cortices only for since the development of language in ancient humans, which goes back maybe 100,000 years at most. We've been developing all these other things as long as we've been alive and as species. So the automatic part of our reasoning is much larger. And let's see, this is his diagram for this, what he called the social intuitionist model. And this is unfortunately, a very, the only way I could get a copy of this is to photograph it with my cell phone and camera and put it in, and it's a little bit less than ideal. But when events trigger something, they trigger our intuitions. Our intuitions then go into creating our judgment. And our judgment leads us to come up with the reasons for what we've already decided based on our intuitions. And these dotted lines going back indicate that our reason can, in very light and relatively weak ways, occasionally make us question either our judgment or our intuitions. But it's our reactions with other people's intuitions and judgments, represented by these lines here, that actually have an effect on our lowest level, our intuitions, which are the actual source for the way we make judgments and come to moral reasons. So if you want to change your mind about something, or if you want to change someone's mind about something, Haidt says, talking in his metaphor, you have to address the elephant. If you want to have an influence on the way someone has made a decision, or if you're open to influences on how you've made a decision, the best way to have that influence flow is to have actual conversations and interactions with another person. If you do it all at the reasoning at the head level, if you do it all by, say, reading a book, it's not as effective. It's a much weaker line. Okay. One of the things he talks about here is what he calls the effects of effective priming. There's a test in which people are given pairs of words, and they're asked to say whether the second word in the pair is good or bad, and to make a value judgment on it. And you'll notice that you have the outside pairs, flower and happiness, where the two words have the same kind of emotional effect. And then cockroach and lonely also have the same kinds of emotional effect. Everyone loves flowers, everyone loves being happy. Everyone who's sensible, at least, hates cockroaches, and nobody likes to be lonely. In the middle here, you have words that are disparate. You like sunshine, but you hate hating. You love love, but you don't love cancer. Excuse me. If you're primed the correct way you make a value judgment faster, in this case for the words happiness and lonely, than for sunshine and cancer, because the first word primes you to make the judgment you want. In the other cases, the first word is priming you to make the judgment you don't want, and you have to fight to overcome the priming in order to come to the correct judgment. One of the things they discovered is that if you ask questions about various moral issues, in the presence of a foul smell, it affects the way people respond. Now, you would think that just standing that if your judgments are all logical, all based on, as Plato would say, on your mind, that just because you're standing next to a garbage can with a really bad odor, you wouldn't change the way you talk about things. But if you are a Humean, as Haidt says we are, then yes, those sorts of triggers pushing the emotions in that way have an effect. Another thing that he talks about is that if people are asked to wash their hands thoroughly before answering a series of questions about situations that are calling for a moral judgment, they become more moralistic about things, and that the reverse happens also. That if people are primed to become morally judgmental about something, they're more likely to want to clean things up. So, you're making your moral judgments on the basis of lots of things that are going on in your head that your conscious mind is not necessarily aware of. And makes this metaphor, which is great for our political situation, says our rational minds act as our press secretaries. Just as political press secretaries find any defense for every action, so do our rational minds. I don't know how many of you watch press secretary briefings. I only watch them occasionally because they're incredibly depressing. But one of the standard things is for an adversarial question from an adversarial network, and the adversarial network changes depending on who's in power and which press secretary is talking. But they'll say something like, knowing what you know now, aren't you sad that you made stupid decision X? And of course, the press secretary can't say, yeah, if we had known then what we know now, we wouldn't have done that stupid thing. No, they have to come up with some sort of defense for it, whether it makes any sense or not. And one of the things that our rational minds will do is if they come up with something called plausible deniability. That is, if we can find some way to rationally argue that something we've done isn't really a violation of a rule. In one experiment, people were deliberately overpaid, given too much money for a task. If they were just given the money, only 20% of them would say, hey, you've given me X amount too much and I need to give this back to you. But the experiment was changed, and the only change was that the cashier would ask each person if they had received the correct amount. And if by just having to say that, you get up to 60% returning the overpayment. And it turned out there's no way to predict who will return the money. People who can score well on tests that are designed to measure awareness of moral issues were just as likely to lie and keep the money as people who didn't do so well on those. So our elephants rule. Listen, this is a quote I want from the rare we want to read. From Plato to Kant and Kohlberg, many rationalists have asserted that the ability to reason well about ethical issues causes good behavior. They believe that reasoning is the royal road to moral truth, and they believe that people who reason well are more likely to act morally. If so, then moral philosophers would be the most moral people. That's anything in brackets is my summary of a long thing that I'm deleting. And the philosopher Erich Spitzengabel tried to find out. He evaluated a list of behaviors that people consider moral, and in none of these ways are philosophers more moral than other philosophers or professors in other fields. In other words, just because you study morals and you know in your mind about what things are moral, it doesn't help. As a matter of fact, it may be a hindrance. He discovered that in libraries that have they keep track of books that are missing because they're either not returned or have been stolen, that people actually steal or keep without returning books on ethics more than books on other areas of philosophy. So that's all kind of depressing. So basically we have I'm going to try to wind this up really within the next 10 minutes for the rest of this. So we have a mind that, sort of doesn't do what we want it to. And there's an acronym that talks about this, and it talks about WEIRD, which stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. The weirder you are, the more you see a world full of separate objects rather than relationships. When asked to write statements about themselves, Americans are most likely to list their own internal psychological characteristics. I'm happy, or other personality traits are unique to them. I'm happy, I'm a good chess player, I love jazz, etc. East Asians are more likely to risk their roles in relationship. I'm a son of, I'm a husband of, etc. We Americans are weirder than Europeans, and the educated upper middle class is most weird of all. So all of us are probably highly weird, except perhaps Rosentown. And based on this, Schneider, who is again is the person opposite who disagreed with Kohlberg, proposed three bases for ethics: autonomy, people should be able to act as they wish. This is often the dominant basis for ethics in many Western systems. Community, all people are part of larger entities, and these entities are more than the sum of their parts. You belong to organizations and you sort of owe them that they are, and divinity. Many societies develop moral concepts. Okay, in such societies, personal liberty of secular Western nations looks like libertinism, hedonism, and a celebration of humanity's baser instincts. Okay, so he's developed basically 5 moral foundations at the beginning, and he later developed this into a group of 6. They're care harm, and the foundation is the positive thing that people are attracted to, and the negative thing that triggers disgust or a feeling of moral condemnation. Care harm, fairness and cheating, loyalty and betrayal, authority, subversion, sanctity, degradation, and liberty, oppression. Okay, let's go back here. And he likes to find evolutionary reasons for our commitment to these triggers, to these emotional foundations. And for care harm, it's obvious the challenge in his beliefs for caring for children. And I don't know if any of you were in seminars where Lindsay Brunner Woodcock talked about music and had her son Theo with us, but you could see the CARE Foundation activated like 120% whenever she was talking. Everyone was paying attention to Lindsay because Lindsay had Theo, and Theo was just as cute and tended to want to, make us want to care for him as any baby I've ever seen in my life. This foundation can also be activated by animal suffering. The killing of seal pups in Canada is often, part of this. Liberals tend to emphasize this foundation more heavily than conservatives do. We'll get to differences between liberals and conservatives and why people can't get along in about 4 or 5 more minutes. Fairness and cheating. Fairness, for many, he mentions that for many people, fairness implies equality, but on the right, and most conservatives, it means proportionality. People should be rewarded in proportion to what they contribute, even if that guarantees unequal outcomes. Personal story about this, I was working on a project in Motorola where people basically had to work 7, 10 days straight in order for things to get done. The project was successful, and the everyone on the project got a bonus of some kind. People who were considered to have been special contributors, and I was one of them, got an extra bonus. But the 2 people who put in the most time and were probably most responsible for success got really big bonuses. And that seemed just fine to me. I was glad. I would have felt bad if Keith and Ernie had wound up with a bonus that was just the same as everyone else's on the team, because they were like working 12-hour days, 10, 12 days in a row. They were, um, you know, they deserve to be treated differently. Um, but then there's another way of looking at this, and this quote from Anatole France: the law in its majestic equality forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal their bread. Well, of course, you know, that's not fair. I mean, if you're rich, you've got a house to go back to. You don't need to sleep under the bridge. You don't need to beg for food. You can just buy it. Um, so treating everyone proportionally sometimes isn't fair. Um, and that's a point of tension between various groups of people. Loyalty, Betrayal Foundation, um, we're often want to form uh, coalitions. Um, Sports teams are an example of this. Um, the Loyalty Foundation is activated donations to educational organizations. My daughter, who is still not paid off all her student loans for going to Johns Hopkins, still gets letters from them saying, hey, don't you want to donate to Johns Hopkins? Um, and they're relying, as all organizations do when they send out letters like that, on people's loyalty to the organization. Authority and subversion. And among this weird, amongst us, there's a tendency to value this foundation, actually see it as a foundation more for immorality than morality. Um, but he's talking about how would want to organize or look at authority in a different light. Um, it says human authority is not just raw power backed by the threat of force. Human authorities take on responsibility for maintaining order and justice. Um, um, and of course, authorities are not always good at that. If we want to understand how human civilizations burst forth and covered the earth in just a few thousand years, we'll have to look closely at the role of authority in creating moral order. And you can think of authority figures that are widely admired, for example, the Dalai Lama, Mother Teresa. There are different ways of looking at authority, um, and uh, and other cultures very often do that in different ways. One of the things when he's talking about this, he's talking about a taxi driver he used very often when he was in D.C. And he was teaching at the University of Virginia there and would be in D.C. fairly often. And he saw the man. He was mentioned that his son had just been born, and he asked the taxi driver, "Oh, are you going to raise your son here, or are you going to go back to Jordan?" He says, "I'm going to go back to Jordan because I never want to hear my son say expletive deleted you to me when he grows up." Um, and now, um, most uh, most children don't say expletive deleted you to their fathers, but in this man's mind, we had no respect for authority here, and he didn't want to have his child grow up with that lack of respect for the elders. And you stop to think about the average sitcom. One of the standard plot devices is that you have the bumbling, doltish father who has smart, clever kids who sort of like, poke at him all the time, and a wise and a more thoughtful wife who kind of puts up with him and tries to paper over the worst of his problems. And if you're a Jordanian father, and that's your view of how American families work, you can see why you wouldn't want to be an American family. Um, and then he talks about sanctity, degradation. And one of the things he meant, and of course, it's very popular amongst the religious right. It's mentioned so that you'll sometimes see the Sanchiti Foundation underlying some of the moral passions in the environmental movement. You could read the rest of the quote for yourself, but I had an experience on a forum in the 90s when I was camping with the Boy Scouts. I had a little coffee maker that would keep the coffee grounds separate from paper, and rather than pack them out, I would just dump them at the base of the tree because coffee grounds are actually good for the soil. And I thought I was, doing nothing wrong, and I got people coming down on me like I had, cut down a 4,000-year-old bristlecone pine tree and burned it. Uh, and what I was doing was just awful. And they were indeed inventing reasons for it, because I was inventing reasons for why it wasn't wrong. But it was the environment being triggered by the Sanchiti Foundation. And eventually he came up with this idea based on feedback from stuff, talking about a liberty oppression factor. And much of this he again gives an evolutionary basis for. But when we were in anthropologists see this in current primitive cultures, if someone just gets too domineering and tries to be in complete control of the group, they'll all get together and kill the guy. Okay. So this is, I will see if I can get this bigger. No, it doesn't want to get bigger. Okay, this is not a particularly easy to read figure, even even in the book, and it didn't photograph as well as I wanted it to. But they've done a series of questionnaires on moral judgments from various people, and they would self-define whether they're liberal, moderate, conservative, and to what degree they feel that they're that way. And these two things here are care and fairness. And you'll notice that they are relatively high for everyone. They only dip down to 3 for very conservative people. For very liberal people, sanctity and authority, which are these, or sanctity, which is this bottom line here, basically is so close to strongly reject that you feel that it has no influence whatsoever. You would probably not have an influence on anyone's thinking until you get to about 2, which is when you start getting to slightly conservative. Loyalty and authority are, again, very low for most people, until you get to at least moderates. So if you're conservative, if you're a liberal, you tend to think that the be all and end all of moral judgment is care and fairness, whether something harms people and whether it involves treating them fairly. And most liberals think of fairness not in terms of proportionality, but in terms of what seems to be best for the person in their particular situation. people on the right tend to make moral judgments based on all of these things. You'll notice that for the conservative columns, basically all the lines pretty much intersect. So conservatives tend to make in this system tend to make all their judgments based on a wide group of things, and liberals tend to value these, and so we think differently, and therefore, because we have our emotions, our intuitions, making judgments based on different things, we can't understand why people make decisions the way they do when they're different from us. And he mentions he wrote an article up basically presenting this idea, saying that, liberals tend to rely pretty much exclusively on care and fairness, while conservatives look at a wider range of things. And he got back a bunch of letters from liberals saying, yeah, I'm glad that you prove that those expletive deleted conservatives are just a bunch of expletive deleteds who don't really care about people. And of course, that wasn't what he said, and it's not what his data tells him. But people tend to, when looking at other people, tend to make judgments about them based on how they process these foundations for their moral judgments. And conservatives do the same thing. They'll say, yeah, you've all heard the term bleeding heart liberal, right? Well, that's pejorative. That's indicating that they think that this emphasis on care, fairness is wrong, that they need to think more like us. Well, what can we do about this? And the conclusion he comes to is that we need to start actually interacting more with people outside our way of thinking. That if you, remember earlier we talked about how that you don't make changes in your moral judgment unless you actually are talking to other people, that just reading books or looking at things doesn't tend to work. And we tend to be in enclaves. If you look at maps of voting patterns in the United States, you'll see that there are these bright blue areas along the East Coast and the West Coast, and centered around university towns and the rest of the country, which is a sea of red. And that would indicate that, like, if you're a liberal in, say, southeastern Oklahoma, your chances of finding someone who thinks like you are pretty slim. If you're a conservative in Midtown Manhattan, you'll have Pauline Kael say that she doesn't know anyone who voted for Nixon. And his belief is that we need to cross boundaries in order to have things change. He was writing this in 2012, and he was kind of hopeful that people would start crossing boundaries. If anything, boundaries have become, I think, less crossable. People have become more judgmental about how their processing of moral issues is right and everyone else's is wrong. We've, if anything, have become more hivish. More, not hivish, more in-groupish, with the sense that we have the truth and the other people, whether they're bleeding heart liberals or fascist authoritarian conservatives, are wrong, and that the opportunity for interaction of the sort that could lead to understanding and change of mind is become harder than it was even 10 years ago when it was hard enough already. So he's written this book that tells us why we're divided by religion and politics, in the hope that we would become less divided, and well, it hasn't worked. But that's probably he would probably tell you that's understandable. Books are addressed to the writer. What we need to do is to address the elephants. And well, I'll leave it at that. Okay, so any questions?
This diagram on the last page is very, or your last screen is very useful.
Yeah, I was hoping I could find that online at one of his websites and not have to rely on a photo of the book, because, as I mentioned, I mean, it just doesn't scale well. But I couldn't. But yeah, one of the things I will say about this is that as I think more and more about what he has to say, I tend to be less critical of people whose opinions differ from mine. Now, that doesn't happen all the time. I'm still, like most of us, convinced that anyone who doesn't see X issue my way must be mentally or morally defective, because I'm always right. But you know, when I really stop to consider where people are coming from in terms of these moral foundations, it makes a difference. I'm not sure if it's a big enough difference, but it helps some, and that's always a good thing. And it's also worth knowing that that you're just as irrational as the next guy who has an opinion that's different from yours. Okay, any other questions, observations? If not, thank you for your time. I hope that this was interesting. If anyone, I didn't talk about the third section, which talks about how we came to believe in and have moral systems, and what the evolutionary advantage is of them. Because although it's very fascinating, it's not actually directly related to the topic of the subtitle. Okay, well, have a good rest of your week. And if anyone actually wants to read the book, it's 300 pages. It's actually very engagingly written, and for a book on philosophical and psychological topics, it's actually easy to read. But that, of course, doesn't mean it's easy to read in absolute terms. So, but if you want to give it a run, let me know. I can loan you my copy. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Warren.
Okay.